You were never meant to choose your future, Nora. This marriage is repayment for the family your father destroyed." Nora stood frozen in the living room, her hands trembling, eyes locked on the man who had spoken them. Her father didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked away, leaving silence in his place. She was only 22, gentle, quiet, raised to obey. Her dreams had always been simple: to finish school, to fall in love slowly, to choose. But now, she was being handed over like currency. A daughter turned into a debt payment. His name was Elijah, 31, wealthy, cold, and chosen. Not by her, but by the past. Her aunt whispered stories in the kitchen when she thought Nora couldn't hear. "The marriage is to settle an old debt," she said. "Elijah's family lost everything because of Nora's father, years ago. This is payback, sealed in wedding vows." Nora's heart broke piece by piece. She tried to protest, to beg older, sister in the night. But she just held her and whispered, "Just survive, my sister." That's when she realized no one was listening. The wedding came quickly. No white gown, no joy. Just a gold dress that didn't feel like hers. And a man with eyes that never once softened. Elijah stood at the altar like a statue. When he said, "I do," he didn't even look at her. The first night was quiet, too quiet. Nora sat on the edge of the expensive bed in his cold mansion, unsure what to do. Elijah came in, loosened his tie, and said one thing before turning away. "Don't expect love. You're only here because of your father's choices." She didn't cry. Not that night. Not in front of him. But when the door closed and she was alone, she wept into the silk pillow until sleep took her away. The days that followed were silent. Elijah was always busy, always distant. He left food, money, instructions, but never warmth. Nora ate alone, walked alone, and slept alone in the same house as a man who clearly didn't want her. But what Elijah didn't know was that Nora's silence wasn't weakness. It was strength. And one day, he would see her differently. One day, he would realize the girl he married for revenge was the only one who could save him from himself. Nora tried her best to stay invisible. She cleaned the house, ironed Elijah's shirts, and made simple meals he rarely touched. Days turned into weeks, and still, he spoke only when necessary. Short, cold sentences that made her feel like nothing more than a tenant in his mansion. But one rainy evening, she heard something that made her pause. Elijah was on the phone in his office, the door slightly ajar. His voice was low but sharp. "Her father begged me to take her," he said. "I agreed only to make him suffer." Nora's stomach twisted. She wasn't just a tool in this marriage. She was a punishment. She backed away before he could see her and ran to her room, heart pounding. For the first time since the wedding, she didn't cry. She just sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, her hands trembling in her lap. He didn't marry her for love. He married her to destroy her. The next morning, Nora served breakfast, like always. But when Elijah sat down, he noticed something different. The table was perfectly set, the eggs soft just how he liked them. But she didn't speak, didn't even look at him. He frowned but said nothing. Later that night, he came home later than usual, wet from the rain, tired from work. Nora opened the door and handed him a towel. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, and something passed between them. Something unspoken. Elijah froze, but she had already turned away. That weekend, Nora fell sick. A quiet fever crept into her bones, and she barely had the strength to get out of bed. She expected Elijah to call a driver or send a maid, but instead he brought the medicine himself. He sat beside her and touched her forehead, his hand surprisingly gentle. "You should have told me," he murmured, placing a cool cloth on her skin. Nora blinked in confusion. It was the first time his voice didn't sound like stone. She whispered, "I didn't want to bother you." His eyes lingered on her face longer than usual. "You're my wife," he said. "It's my job to be bothered." The fever passed after 2 days, but something lingered in the air. Elijah wasn't quite the same. He started coming home earlier, asking if she had eaten, leaving small things on the table. Her favorite fruits, her scarf in her favorite color, herbal teas she once mentioned. He never said why. But she noticed one night while Nora was cleaning up after dinner, she found a book on her pillow. It was the same one she used to read as a child. The one her mother sold when things got bad. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside the front cover was a note in Elijah's handwriting. "I saw this in a store. Thought of you." She stared at the words for a long time, and for the first time since she came into his house, she smiled. It had been a month since their quiet marriage, and though Elijah's words were still few, Nora felt something change. He no longer avoided her eyes. Sometimes he even lingered in the kitchen while she cooked, pretending to scroll through his phone, though his gaze often rested on her hands as she stirred the pot. One afternoon, as she opened a drawer to find clean linens, she discovered something strange. A photograph. It was old, slightly torn, and tucked beneath some papers. In the photo, Elijah was much younger, standing beside her father. They were smiling, but behind the smile, something in Elijah's eyes looked broken. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. The picture haunted her. Why had her father never mentioned this connection? Why had Elijah, the man she now shared a bed with, once smiled beside the man who had forced this marriage? The pieces didn't fit, and her heart wasn't ready for the truth. The next morning, Elijah caught her staring at the photo on the table. His jaw tightened. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice low. Nora hesitated, unsure whether to lie. But she didn't. "Why were you with my father?" she whispered. Elijah said nothing for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "He was the reason my family lost everything." Nora's breath hitched. The words fell like stones. "What do you mean?" she asked. Elijah turned away, the pain thick in his voice. "Your father ruined my father's company, left us with nothing. My mother died 2 years later from stress. I was just 19. For the first time, Nora saw the weight Elijah carried. Not just anger, but grief, loss, and under it all, a wound that had never closed. "So this marriage," she began slowly, her voice shaking. Elijah looked at her. "Was never about you," he said quietly. "At least, not in the beginning." Nora stood still, her hands trembling at her sides. She had been a pawn, a punishment, a name on a marriage certificate meant to settle old scores. But then, why the warm tea? Why the book from her childhood? Why the gentleness in his eyes when she was sick? Before she could ask, Elijah stepped closer. "I thought if I married you, your father would suffer. But he never cared about you, did he?" Nora's lips parted in shock. He had seen it too, the way her father handed her over without a second thought. She wasn't a daughter to that man, just a debt to pay. Elijah's voice softened. "I thought I was hurting him, but I was only hurting you." Nora's heart ached with 1,000 emotions she couldn't name. Pain, confusion, but also something else. Something dangerous and tender blooming beneath her ribs. That evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, the silence between them felt different. Not heavy, but filled with questions. Nora dared to ask one. "Do you regret it?" Elijah looked up slowly. "Every day I see what this marriage cost you," he said. "I regret how it started, but not that it happened." The words curled around her heart like smoke. She excused herself quietly and went to the garden. The air was cool. Stars blinked above. She needed space to breathe. But when she turned to go back inside, she saw him standing at the door, just watching her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, tears threatening. "But I'm not sure I want to leave either." Elijah stepped into the moonlight. "Then stay," he said softly, "and let me earn the forgiveness." The next morning, Nora found a small tray outside her bedroom door. On it was a warm mug of tea and a note. Just 5 words, written in Elijah's sharp, precise handwriting. "I'm sorry for everything." Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It was the first time he had apologized. Not for revenge, not for the past, but for hurting her. Later, that day she returned to the old family library, a place she had avoided since the wedding. Dust clung to every corner, but on the desk sat a stack of unopened letters. Curious, she picked one. It was addressed to her, in her mother's handwriting. Nora's breath caught. Her mother had passed 5 years ago. But this letter, it had never reached her. She tore it open with shaking hands. Inside, her mother had written of her regret, of how she had wanted to protect Nora from the cold, business-minded man she had married. "If anything ever happens to me," the letter read, "and your father tries to use you for gain, remember this: you are worth more than any contract." Nora pressed the letter to her chest and wept. Her mother had known. Somehow she had seen it coming. She had tried to leave her daughter a map, and Nora had finally found it, years too late, but perhaps not too late to take back control of her life. That evening, Elijah found her in the library, the letter still in her lap. She didn't speak. She just handed it to him. He read it slowly, his brows furrowing, his jaw tightening. "Your mother was brave," he whispered, "and your father. He never deserved either of you." Nora looked at him then, truly looked at him. "Why didn't you ever ask if I had a choice?" she asked. Elijah lowered his gaze. "Because I assumed you didn't care," he said. "I thought you were like him." Nora's voice trembled. "And now?" Elijah met her eyes. "Now, I see you, and I'm ashamed." For a long time, neither of them moved. The space between them was heavy. Not with anger anymore, but with a fragile kind of understanding. Nora wanted to hate him. She should have. But part of her didn't want to walk away from this man who had hurt her, but had also started to change. The next day, Elijah disappeared for hours. Nora assumed he had gone to work, but when he returned, he was holding a folder. "These are the original marriage papers," he said, "signed under pressure by your father. I've drawn up annulment forms. If you want to leave, you can." Nora's eyes widened. "You'd let me go?" she whispered. Elijah nodded. "I said I wanted revenge, but I never wanted to be the man who traps a woman the way your father trapped me." Her hands shook as she reached for the papers, but she didn't take them. Instead, she said, "Do you want me to go?" Elijah's breath hitched. Slowly, he shook his head. "No," he said. "But this time, the choice should be yours." That night, Nora didn't sleep. She sat by the window staring out at the quiet lawn, the moonlight casting long shadows over the world she once felt imprisoned in, now holding freedom in her own hands. And just before dawn, she made her decision. The next morning, Nora stood at the front gate, a suitcase in her hand. Elijah watched from the doorway, his heart pounding. He thought she had made her choice, that she had decided to leave. But when she turned around, there was no pain in her eyes, just calm. "I packed everything," she said quietly, "because I needed to feel like I could walk away." She stepped closer. "But I'm not going anywhere." Elijah didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight in his chest began to lift, piece by piece. Nora set down the suitcase. "I'm not staying for my father, and I'm not staying because of the past," she whispered. "I'm staying because, somehow, through all the lies and the hurt, I started falling in love with you." It was the first time she'd said the word, love, and it didn't sound like weakness. It sounded like power, like healing. Elijah closed the distance between them, his hands trembling. "I don't deserve that," he said hoarsely. Nora smiled, softly. "Maybe not, but neither do I deserve to keep living like I'm broken." That night, they sat by the fireplace, the same place where they had once argued in silence. Now, their silence felt different. It felt safe. Elijah turned to her. "There's something I still haven't told you," he said. Nora braced herself. "What is it?" His eyes met hers. "Your father didn't just ruin my family. He ruined someone else's too. Someone I loved." Nora's breath caught. "Who?" Elijah's gaze darkened. "My older brother," he said. "He trusted your father, signed everything over. 1 month later, he was gone. Bankrupt, alone. He took his life, Nora. That's what started my hatred." A tear slipped down her cheek. She had known her father was ruthless, but this was cruelty beyond business. Nora reached for Elijah's hand. "You didn't deserve that," she whispered. Elijah closed his eyes. "I wanted to destroy your family, but instead, I fell in love with the one part of it I never expected to." The next morning, everything changed. A letter arrived at the gate. No name, no return address. Just a blood-red seal. Elijah opened it carefully, his face turning pale as he read. Nora stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. Elijah looked up slowly. "It's your father," he said. "He knows we're not just pretending anymore. And he's coming." Nora's heart dropped. "What does he want?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "He wants you back under his control, and he'll stop at nothing." She stood frozen. "Even now?" Elijah nodded. "Especially now." That evening, the sky darkened with an approaching storm. Lightning cracked across the clouds. As rain began to fall, Nora stood by the window, remembering her mother's letter. "If your father ever tries to use you, remember, you are worth more than any contract." She turned to Elijah. "We need to end this, together." Elijah looked at her. "Are you sure?" Nora nodded. "I won't run, not anymore. This ends with me. Not just for us, but for every life my father tried to control." And as thunder rumbled in the distance, Elijah reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a secret he had kept for too long. "Then it's time I show you everything," he said. "The files, the truth, the last weapon we have against him." Nora stared at the envelope Elijah handed her. It felt heavier than paper should, like it carried the weight of everything they had been through. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were photos, documents, letters, all signed with her father's name, all soaked in betrayal. Morning came with silence, but it didn't last. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Elijah stepped outside, shielding Nora behind him. From the car, a man stepped out, tall, cold, powerful. It was her father. Nora's breath hitched. She hadn't seen him in months, not since the wedding. He didn't smile. "Come home, Nora," he said calmly. "You've made your point. Now it's time to end this nonsense." Nora stepped forward slowly. Her voice didn't shake. "I'm not your property," she said. "You can't summon me like I'm a deal to be closed." Her father raised an eyebrow. "You've always belonged to this family. Don't forget who gave you everything." Elijah stepped forward. "You gave her control? Or chains?" Nora's father's eyes narrowed. "You think this girl will stay with you once she sees the life she walked away from?" Nora smiled bitterly. "I've seen enough. Money doesn't matter. Control doesn't impress me. What matters is the truth, and I know it now." Her father's lips curled. "You sound just like your mother?" Nora took a step closer. "And she died miserable, didn't she? Because you controlled her too." There was a flicker in his expression, just for a second. Regret or rage? Elijah held up the envelope. "We have enough here to destroy you in court," he said. "But we don't want your empire. We just want peace." Nora looked her father in the eye. "Leave us alone, or the world finds out." He stared at her, then turned to Elijah. "You won't always be able to protect her." Elijah didn't flinch. "Try me." With one final glare, her father walked back to his car and drove off. The air around them finally loosened. Nora exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. The morning after, her father left. In the kitchen, Elijah was making coffee. Simple, silent, steady. He looked up when she entered, his eyes tired but warm. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Nora shook her head. "I kept thinking, what if he comes back?" Elijah leaned against the counter. "Then we face him, together." They sat by the window watching the sun rise over the garden. For the first time in months, there were no secrets between them, no lies, no revenge, just two people who had survived a storm they never asked for. Nora turned to him. "You never told me when it changed," she whispered. "When I stopped being a target and became someone you cared about." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked at her like he always did, like she was something he didn't believe he deserved. "The night you cried in your sleep," he said softly. "That's when I knew. You weren't part of my plan anymore. You were part of my heart." Nora's eyes welled up, but she blinked quickly, trying to stay strong. "Do you think we can ever have something normal?" she asked. Elijah smiled, faintly. "I don't want normal. I just want real. And this is real." That evening, Elijah asked her to meet him outside. The sky was painted with soft gold and lavender. Fireflies danced in the warm air. Nora stepped into the garden barefoot, her hair loose, her heart still healing. Elijah was standing beneath the tree where they had their first argument. Only this time he wasn't angry. He looked nervous. In his hands, a small velvet box. "Never got to ask you properly," he said. "I hurt you. I lied. I made you feel like you were nothing but a pawn. But you became the only thing that mattered." He opened the box. A new ring. Simple. Beautiful. Nora, will you marry me? Again? This time, with no secrets? She stared at him, heart pounding. And then she smiled, the kind of smile she hadn't worn in years. Yes, she whispered. Yes, because now I'm choosing you. And this time, it's mine to choose. They kissed under the fading light, two broken people building something whole, not out of revenge, not out of duty, but out of love. If someone once married you for revenge but ended up falling in love, would you forgive them, or would you walk away? Comment below. I want to hear your story.